Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Hampton. I am the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. I'm welcoming you today to the inaugural event in a new series of Townsend Center conversations that we will be hosting over the 2020-2021 academic year. The series is called Remaking Sense: The Humanities in Pandemic Culture. It's based on the premise that the onset of the pandemic, like every major historical crisis, brings with it the obligation to rethink our culture, to consider the importance of value and meaning in human creativity, and to ask where we go from here. In the university and in social life more generally, it is the arts and humanities that offer us the resources for such processes of reconsideration. Over the coming months, we will feature conversations with Berkeley scholars, artists, and campus leaders about how we might direct our attention, as our title has it, to remaking sense. Our second event in this series will take place on October 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. It will feature a conversation between Catherine Gallagher, Emerita Professor of English at Berkeley, and Anthony Cascardi, the Dean of the Division of Arts and Humanities. The title of their conversation will be Changing the Narrative. They will focus on the resources of narrative and of narrative art and narrative understanding for confronting a moment in which old stories seem to have fallen apart and new stories are waiting to be told. Today's event, to which I want to turn now, is titled Acting Out: Performance and Community in the Post-Community. We have three guests whom I am delighted to welcome. First is SanSan Kwan, who is a faculty member in Berkeley's Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. Professor Kwan is both a dance practitioner and an historian of dance. She has danced professionally in New York and remains active as a dancer with the Lenora Lee Dance Company. She has written widely on the history of Asian American performance, on kinesthesia, on performance spaces, and on intercultural exchange. Also with us is Myra Melford, professor of music at Berkeley. Professor Melford is a widely celebrated jazz pianist and composer who has performed around the world in venues ranging from jazz at Lincoln Center to SF Jazz. She has released some 40 albums of her own music as a solo artist with her quintet Snowy Egret and with a variety of collaborators. Finally, it's my great pleasure to welcome Jeremy Geffen, who is the executive and artistic director of Cal Performances at UC Berkeley. Formerly senior director and artistic director at Carnegie Hall in New York, Jeremy has for several decades been a leader internationally in arts programming, in expanding the range and scope of arts programs, and in bringing performance and teaching into dialogue. So thank you all three for being here today. Our plan is to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes and then to open the conversation up to questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and you're interested in responding to the conversation with a question, please use the chat function on your Zoom screen, and we'll try to get to questions at the end of the hour. So here we are, and we wanted to bring you three together for our inaugural event because performance seems so important to our sense of who we are as human beings and as members of community. And now we've lost it. Almost overnight, it seems, being in a traditional performance context, sitting in a club or going to a recital hall is among the most dangerous things you can do. You can get a sandwich, but you can't go into a cafe and hear music. So I'd like to begin by asking all of you to reflect a bit, both on how this lost experience is changing the way you think about your own work and about what kinds of new approaches you may be on the horizon for us. So perhaps we should turn first to you, Myra, because you are a very active and busy performer year-round. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what that feels like and how it's helping you think about your work.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. I think probably, sort of the most striking thing for me has been that lack of coming together with other people, performing with other musicians, playing for a live audience, and that kind of connection and feedback loop that's so important, I think, to the performing arts. That's probably been, sort of the most critical thing that I've experienced. But I've also spent more time in Berkeley than I ever have since I moved here. And so it's really, it's interesting. I miss performing, and I miss that kind of engagement out in the world, but it's also given me some time to reflect on what projects I really want to be doing and what's the best way to use this time to develop as a musician. And so, it's been a mixed bag, but I think I think we are all, and it's not just performers, but audiences alike are really missing that connection and community that we get through going to experience live performance.
SanSan?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. It is great to be here, or there, or in the nowhere, wherever we are. Yeah, I agree with Myra that that it is. I am definitely mourning the advantages and the beauty of live performance and that wonderful synergy of bodies connecting with one another face to face. And at the same time, I think that there are, as artists, we are creative and we're resilient, and there have been a lot of really exciting new competencies that we have gained, that I am gaining, that I'm definitely new at, but I'm getting better at. And also, I'm really excited by the kind of creative work that's coming out of this moment. And I think that some of these new competencies, these new skills that we're gaining, both as spectators and as performers, will have a lasting impact and will hang on to. So there are sad things and there are exciting things. I'll say one more thing, and that is, as a dancer and a dance scholar, I think that despite all of the wonderful new competencies that we're gaining, at the same time, I think that this moment reminds us of the urgency of what we do as performing artists and as scholars and people in presenting, like Jeremy on the presenting side of things. The urgency and the importance and the value of the face-to-face encounter, of liveness, of kinesthesia, of being in a room together.
Jeremy.
This is picking up on the thread of community that is missing. I've heard from people I wouldn't have expected to articulate this, but that of the things that they miss most from their pre-pandemic life, it is performance, and part of that is the liminal space, the reflection of humanity back to you that comes from the stage. But just as much, there is this absence of forgive me for using the word community again, but the connection with like-minded people from around you, who may, when you think of the act of sitting in an audience, you may or may not know people around you, but you are united by this one shared moment. And whatever else happens to you in your lives, you will always have this moment, and your paths may cross. You may take away a very different understanding, but it is a uniter, and especially at a time of incredible division, any moment of unity that we no longer have is a great loss.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that it makes us a community. Performance makes us a community, whether we are a community or not. I actually just met somebody a couple of months ago who was at Woodstock, and the old cliche about being a Woodstock. I mean, I wasn't at Woodstock, but he was at Woodstock, and he has something in common with 500,000 other people, and they all probably are telling stories about that experience of Woodstock. I mean, that's an extreme example, obviously, but even any experience you go to. And the extraordinary thing about performance is that you can go into a cafe in West Berkeley and hear fabulous music and remember it for years. And it happens almost by chance on occasion.
It does make me think of two things, though. One is I think that this moment allows us to have an expanded or a new or nuanced definition of what community is. And the wonderful thing about working remotely is that we can work across regions and geographic spaces in ways that we couldn't have in previously, or that we didn't take advantage of in the way that we all are forced to take advantage of now, so that the kinds of collaborations and the kind of audiences that we can reach is much expanded. And I think that's a really exciting thing. And then the second thing that what you all are making me think about is, I don't know if anyone caught the Sunday New York Times piece in the arts and leisure section on how to rethink theater. And they interviewed a bunch of different theater makers and artists. And there was one piece on, what if we rethought some of the accepted conventions we have about what it means to go to the theater. And one of the things that we could rethink, there are a bunch that we can bring up, but one of them that Jeremy's comment about being in a dark space together made me think about was that one recommendation was, what if we got rid of this presumed convention that we all sit quietly in a dark room together and don't say anything and don't have any reactions except when we're supposed to stand up and clap at the end. And I really liked that idea, that what if we had a totally different idea of what it meant to be in community, even when we are live again and when we're together. Like, what if we actually reacted back to the performance that we were watching, and how might this be an opportunity to rethink all of those presumed conventions?
Yeah, that's something that I think we sort of encounter more in certain kinds of music, right? In a jazz concert, it's very common for the audience to yell or clap, in the middle of a performance. And that sort of electricity is so, it just, it spurs you on, and it inspires you. And I imagine, wasn't there a time in theater when people actually did sort of where it was accepted to respond like that? And perhaps also in classical music. I don't know about that, but I agree that it would be great if it started to, that if we started to think about some of the conventions and realize that maybe they're not as necessary, or they no longer serve us in any kind of useful way. And for that reason, just being able to chat with people while you're experiencing something is, such a great thing. So I agree that, yeah. Oh, sorry, Jeremy.
No, I was going to say that one of the things we're missing right now is that we are only able to interact with those people we have intentionally set up an arrangement to interact with. The opportunity to exchange words with a stranger, those no longer exist. You're not going to spontaneously run into anyone, so you have to plan. To your point about the rituals or traditions that will survive this moment, I think it is a great opportunity to see what people intentionally decide to discard, and that which they forget about because it's anomalous. I can't tell you the number of performances that I've been in which the artist finishes the performance, the audience applauds, artist leaves the stage, comes back on stage, applause continues, and there's this expectation of 3 times. And if it's less than 3 times, it probably wasn't very successful. But what is this game of peekaboo, and how did it start? And is that something that we need? and I'm not saying that it's not valuable, but it's a question.
Yeah, and Myra, you're right. I mean, it is historically and culturally specific to, the West now. This idea that we sit quietly and then we stand up and clap, and that it happens 3 times, and that doesn't happen in all cultures, and it hasn't happened, for time immemorial. So why do we do it?
So that suggests that as our culture becomes more global anyway, we're heading in those kinds of directions. I mean, of course, we're all familiar with various kinds of avant-garde performance in the theater where there's audience participation and so on and so forth. But as you're suggesting, SanSan, there are also other traditions, global traditions, in which these kind of conventions of Western performance don't pertain, and those are already in some way becoming a part of the more traditional Western culture, and this will possibly push us more into those kinds of directions. So I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that people have said. So SanSan used the word competency a couple of times, which I thought was a word I had not really thought about, but yes, we're developing new competencies. I just am wondering about, are there ways in which you are doing your work differently when you do it online? In other words, when you perform, when you teach, when you curate, put things together, are you doing this stuff differently now, given the resources of online contact, but also the limitations? I mean, how has it changed what you do?
Can I start out by saying that I think that there was a time when whenever a camera was present, an artist was on edge because a document was being created, and there were few enough documents that there was a lot at risk in having what you were doing in that moment preserved. And there were some artists who were very open to having live recordings, and then there were some who said, absolutely not. I will only do my work in the studio where I have the opportunity to present the apotheosis of my vision for this performance. I think we're now flooded with performance information, and not that anyone wants to be poorly represented, but I think artists are more comfortable living in the moment with a camera in front of them.
I was going to say that that it's been a learning curve for me. I don't know if it's a new competency or not that I'm developing, but to think about my relationship to the audience in this space that's neither a recording studio or a live concert space. And how am I somehow acknowledging that people are out there watching and listening at the same time that I have no evidence of that? And it's almost like developing a kind of acting skill or something for me. But I have to say, I have done less live streaming than making recordings, and then having those stream, but being on hand to talk about them or contextualize them. And that's been a kind of an interesting thing that, we've had this history of Q&A with the artists after the concert, or, a pre-concert talk. But the idea that there can be more interaction ongoing through a performance is an interesting, I think, possibility that we might want to consider, embracing going forward.
It's been oh, sorry, SanSan.
No, go ahead.
I remember when the debate first arose about the role of social media in the concert hall, and what do we do? Do we allow it? Do we put people who want to tweet in one section where they're not going to bother others? At the moment, the way that we're taking in performances, you can do whatever you want. You're in the confines of your own home. And I think everyone's going to determine what what the parameters are for their ability to digest a performance as a result.
SanSan, you were going to speak.
I was just going to say that, despite the fact that, we have screens and video and recording all the time, and it's more pervasive than it once was, going back to what Jeremy said, I still freeze in front of a camera. I still get quite nervous about it. But, even just this webinar situation is at odd, because we're having a conversation, but there's a vague sense that there's an audience out there who's logging in, but we can't see them. So we're exactly in the situation that we're talking about. But in terms of, new competencies, I haven't had the experience of doing any live streamed performances either. I've watched some, and I have been in rehearsal that, we were rehearsing for a piece that was originally going to be an immersive piece, site specific and immersive, meaning that the audience would be quite close to us, in moving with us through rooms and spaces. And then we had to pivot as the shelter in place mandates came down. And so we had to learn how to even just rehearse across Zoom, and started to think about the ways in which this piece might then become a filmed work. And then the conversations we started having is like, how do you create the same kind of, or maybe really a different kind of intimacy than the kind of intimacy that you'd have in immersive performance? And so again, an expanded notion of what intimacy means. Like on the one hand, it's quite intimate that somebody is watching from their living room couch, or while they're making dinner or whatever, in their personal spaces. It's a different kind of intimacy than them moving through rooms with us as we dance for them live. But it is its own kind of intimacy. So how do we? How can we sort of embrace that?
But is it also, do you perform differently then to respond to this new kind of intimacy, right?
Yeah, I would say so. And one of the things that that has been a learning curve for me is like, okay, so screen dance, that's really different from three-dimensional dance. Like all of a sudden, the kinds of movement phrases and the kinds of projection that I need to think about it's not about projecting my 3D person, my 3D body, out to the balcony. It's really more about my 3D body becoming a 2D body, and really thinking more about simpler gestures, simpler phrases, more close-ups. So yeah, in terms of actual technical adaptations, I mean, screen dance is really different from dance that happens on a proscenium stage.
Yeah, I think there are similarities in music. One thing that occurs to me, though, just jumping back to the intimacy, is it's not only that we're presenting ourselves. That the audience is in their own space, but we're in our own space, and we're inviting all these people into our homes or our studios and that's a kind of intimacy, or a way of connecting and learning something about an artist or someone that we don't get when we meet in an institutionalized or a public space, which I think is actually really cool. But I wanted to say we have a similar issue with performing music over the internet, which is very challenging as well. And what I've learned through doing some of it, even for the last few years before the pandemic, doing these co-located concerts with colleagues at other UCs and things like that, it's more like being in a recording studio. So you get this very great detail. You can hear very little sounds. Space works very well, and the opposite, a lot of density or a lot of information or a lot of volume does not translate well, even though that's one of the things that is so exciting when you're at a live concert. So it's definitely definitely changes the work that you do, and also your ideas about aesthetics.
I think I'm going to say something that some people are going to find heretical, but for years I couldn't understand why people were so enamored of the voice of Birgit Nielsen or of Montserrat Caballé. And it took me a long time to get that a recording, a microphone cannot capture, as you point out, Myra, volume, size, and there is a visceral thrill in the way your body responds to a musical performance, the way the sound hits you, and the microphone can actually be quite cruel to some people, and it can favor others depending on on their attributes and what they're trained to do in a performance space. You know, at the moment, Cal Performance is recording artists in venues around the world where they are sheltering in place, and it's meant to be a live performance, but it's a live performance in a format that many artists would have normally thought of as a recording. So how do you capture that spirit of aliveness or liveness, and also aim for what the camera and the microphone will respond to, rather than what you're trained to do in trying to make your sound project to the last row of a 3,500 seat auditorium. These are new types of questions that artists are learning how to address, and I assume are coming up with conclusions on their own that are corroborated by what they hear from others about their performances.
I read somewhere recently, and I was delighted by it, that it's possible that this moment and these platforms might actually favor older dancers who don't rely merely on the explosive virtuosic move, but perhaps on detail and subtlety. And so that I thought was a pretty great advantage.
Yeah.
So one of the things, it seems to me that one of the things that you're all talking about in some way is the question of context, that somehow new kinds of contextualization are being imposed on us in a certain kind of way. And that breaks with the way in which we would contextualize something traditionally. I mean, going to, let's say, a performance at Cal Performances and getting the program, and there will be historical information explaining what's happening, or when you go to the opera and you get a resume of the plot. It seems to me that we're being asked now to contextualize and to put different kinds of frames around the art experience or the performance experience as we perform it, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think some of that is just because we're making up, I think, initially for something that was lacking. But I think as we do it, and it's done in interesting ways, and you actually mentioned a great example one time when we were talking about this, about something like Theater of War, that's really finding a whole new way to present performance and then contextualize it and bring together different communities that we wouldn't necessarily do in a live venue, but that might work very well in a live venue, were we to go back, to the venue with that kind of idea.
Right. So just for our audience, if you're not familiar with Theater of War, it's a Brooklyn-based theatrical group that's been setting up dialogues between actors performing bits of classic plays and people who are involved in working on the front lines in the pandemic. And some of those performances are extraordinarily powerful and very, very, very moving. And you're right, that also imposes a kind of new relationship to the text of the play, or perhaps to what a score of music would be. I mean, you're used to fooling around with scores and taking them apart and putting them back together already. But I mean, I've also noticed one of the things Jeremy's been doing recently, which is really wonderful in the UC Berkeley community, is curating collections of videos that are just extraordinary. I mean, it takes him back to, I'm sure, his days as a young DJ, bringing together now videos from old blues musicians, putting them together with contemporary classical musicians. I mean, it's an extraordinary privilege to watch that stuff. And in some way it's been imposed on us, but it's also a new resource.
It is really interesting that this moment is an intersection of past, present, and future. That because we're not seeing anyone live in front of us, we can see everyone live in front of us. And in that, thank you for your kind words about the Now More Than Ever series. In the most recent episode, I chose a selection from the last night of the proms, which did happen this year, in spite of all odds. But it's like no other last night of the proms in that there's no audience in the Royal Albert Hall, and in fact the members of the BBC singers were in the seats where the audience would have been, so that they can sing from a safe distance. And I think years from now, we'll look back at that video and think that that is a document of what we were experiencing in the moment. That's how our children and grandchildren will come to understand this pandemic.
I'm thinking now of something you said when we were speaking the other day, that that this moment really has a kind of, I mean, every moment is unique, but it's extraordinary that it should come at this moment, given the technological innovations of the past 15 years. If this had happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when we didn't have the kind of resources that we have now to speak online in the way we're doing, our experience would be completely different.
Absolutely, this would have been.
We would be back to using smoke signals or carrier pigeons to communicate, I expect. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit, though, because we've been talking about the sort of good things. Maybe that's not exactly the right adjective, but we've been talking about sort of new resources that are seen to be emerging, new practices, new ways of thinking about performance. But we're also at a moment of extraordinary economic hardship in the world of the arts. Everybody has basically had the chair knocked out from under them. Everyone from large world famous orchestras to small rock and jazz combos have been simply sidelined. So, I mean, maybe Jeremy, since you think about this a lot, maybe you could just give us a sense of how you think that's unfolding, and then I'd certainly obviously love to hear from both Myra and SanSan on this question of the economics of it.
Myra made the comment earlier that she'd never spent so much time at home, and I think that's been the experience of most artists, that all of a sudden everything in their calendar vanished, and it vanished without an endpoint. So there's uncertainty as to when and how they're going to be able to resume their careers, and I think we are going to see a rethinking of whether being a professional artist is worth the risk. There are going to be people who self-select out, and that of course is a great shame, because you never know what you're not able to experience. The arts organizations themselves are under tremendous pressure. For an organization like Cal Performances, the majority of our income is in the form of earned revenue, and that has vanished. So we become dependent on contributed income, and new business models like the Cal Performances at Home initiative that cannot net even anywhere close to what a live performance can. And of course, there aren't the same expenses, but it's a huge disruptor, and it's industry-wide, worldwide. I'm seeing that institutions, German orchestras are touring within Germany at the moment. They're able to visit other cities and play in other halls. But if you see the camera flipped on the audience, you'll see that it's probably a tenth of the hall that's full. So in countries that have a strong tradition of state subsidy for the arts, there's a greater chance of resilience.
Yeah, I was going to say that for me, and this maybe is not so much an economic issue, but the prospect that in darker moments that we won't go back to the kind of live concertizing that we were doing before is really, it's almost like more than I can even, think about. But I do feel like I just have this idea about needing new models for how we support the arts. And it seems to me that, we're all benefiting a lot from technology right now. And it would be so great if we could get these big tech companies, for instance, or, to invest in real art, not just to demonstrate how wonderful their new application is, but to, say, okay, now it's our responsibility at this point, to turn around and invest in these institutions or projects or whatever. But that may be a pipe dream, but I do think that we really do, as a society, have to find. I can't imagine that there isn't anyone out there that's going to miss this. Maybe there's some people, but I think we need to find new ways. And I think there'll be a lot of grassroots kind of things, because musicians need to make music, and at least, younger musicians coming up. I'm thinking of young jazz musicians in New York, for instance, who have now lost not only some income, but, what they need to develop their careers, that those people, I think, will, if they can survive, will find a way to start from the beginning again, with grassroots kind of organizing.
I feel like this moment is, it reveals how precarious we all already were. And it just, the fact that there is no safety net for artists was always true. It's just that now we really need that safety net. There is a movement afoot, pun intended, for dancers to unionize. So that, that has its pluses and minuses, of course, because that's going to be on the backs of dance companies or presenting venues. So, how does that work? But to go back to that New York Times article about rethinking theater, there were a couple of interesting ideas in it. One of them was this idea that Broadway and off-Broadway and off-Broadway operate like major and minor league baseball. In other words, that they would redistribute revenue, so that Broadway theaters would take all of the revenue that they get and distribute it down, quote unquote, to off and off Broadway, which feeds Broadway anyway. So I like that idea. I also think that this is a moment that we take advantage of what we learned about, or what we're learning about live streaming, and opening up our archives to make that more accessible and more available to more audiences. I mean, the prices for tickets at most, performing venues are outside the scope of accessibility to a lot of people. So what would it be like if we rethought that model and made theater and dance and performance more accessible to more people via things like streaming and opening up our archives?
So it sounds like you're suggesting that precarity should lead to a certain kind of generosity that that's always been on the horizon, but we've never been able to quite access.
Or we haven't prioritized it.
We haven't prioritized it, indeed. Yeah. I was wondering, we're time is moving on, and so I would encourage. We've got a number of people who have sent in questions for our panelists, and we'll turn to those in a few minutes. But I had one other thing I wanted to talk to you. I mean, there are a lot of things we could talk about, but I've been thinking a lot, obviously, as I always do, about education. And so, all three of you are educators in addition to being arts people. And how is this situation changing the way we think about education? I mean, we all work at the University of California, so teaching is part of what we do in any number of venues on any number of levels. And what can we say about the way in which that process is being changed by the current moment?
Well, the challenge of teaching, an ensemble, for instance, over the internet is daunting still, even with all the technology that we have. Um, and so I think in part it's been rethinking, for me, what is a useful activity we can do together that may not mean everybody getting to rehearse their parts together.
Right.
And so a different kind of study of the music we're learning that often doesn't happen when you walk into a rehearsal room and someone puts a chart in front of you and you start playing the notes in front of you, really understanding where that piece came from and what the composer intended and who their mentors were, and understanding sort of how the strategies and the approaches taken, at least in the world of improvised music, is part of this much bigger picture, and that the music is not the notes on the page. So I've been working a lot on that, as well as taking my students back to solo, how important it is that they be able to function as a solo artist right now. But I had one other thought I wanted to say. I noticed last spring when we went into shelter in place, I was teaching a fair, 45 student class about improvisation across disciplines. And I spent a lot of time putting the students in small groups because I felt like the one thing they were really missing and needed was this ability to talk together, and that kind of intimacy that they had just completely lost. And that seemed to be a really good thing. And I might not do that quite as much in a classroom where we could all talk together, for instance.
That's right.
I would say pretty much everything that Myra said follows with the dance as well. I think that our student learning objectives just have to change, and they're less about, for Myra, it's following the notes, and for us, it's like, mimicking the technique, performing the technique. And it's more about like honoring your individual response to a particular movement phrase that you're being given. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. And also, students are, in terms of going back to the idea of new competencies, students are being asked more and more now in our classes to get familiar with screen dance. And they're going to take those skills and move us forward in the field with these new competencies. And then, yes, I really like what Myra said about putting students in small groups. I think one of the things that we're learning is that, these circumstances for students where they're, sitting in front of their computers looking at Zoom all day and all of their other classes is difficult. And that actually what a dance class, or perhaps a music class as well, offers is a moment of self-care where they can come back into their bodies and come back into art and expressive culture and presence. And so in some ways, we are not seeing a diminishment of enrollment in dance classes, even though they're all online, because I think students just need to be in their bodies.
I hearing the two of you talk made me wonder about the very seeds that you're talking about planting right now, of paying attention to your own craft and getting in touch with who you are as an artist, are going to sprout the moment that we're back in some sort of performance, that art thrives with interaction. That's what raises people's game. So on one hand, the artists are going to be that much more inspired by being in the presence of the actual physical presence of their peers. But the other side of it is that what happens, right, the type of art making that it's happening at the moment is very directed. That you can determine the angle by which you are seen, how you want your dance to be presented, exactly how the viewer will take it in. And when you're in a larger space, it's less directed. I wouldn't say undirected. There's much more responsibility on the individual to determine what the audience member, what is important to them in that moment. So I think we're teaching people tools in an implied way that will become explicit outside.
That's a fantastic reflection. Thank you so much. I think maybe we can turn now to some of the questions that we've been getting. So one of the first questions that we got when we first began talking, and this is possibly as much as anything else in response to my own introduction, was to say, is there such a thing as a pandemic culture? Are we talking now, I mean, do these practices, do these new competencies, this new form of intimacy, new forms of thinking about time, new forms of thinking about education, does this emerge into a particular kind of culture of its own, or are these just adaptive processes that we're sort of taking on for the moment and then they'll be gone? It sounds to me like you're suggesting that there is something new that's emerging. I mean, you all seem to be suggesting that there are a new set of practices and values and new kinds of meaning that are being generated that were not being generated before, and that in some way are taking on a kind of life of their own. Is that a fair description?
I think without being able to predict the future, that's certainly my sense. Yeah. You know, that there's no way that this period isn't going to affect what comes after it, whether we're in pandemic or not. Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that there's ways in which we're watching and ways in which we're making that are specific to this moment. So that's, I think, maybe what the person is getting at when they say a pandemic culture. Yes, it's definitely something that we're going to learn and take with us, but it's also the way I watch and the way I dance in this shelter in place moment is specific to being sheltering in place and in this weird distended sense of time and this weird disembodied, disoriented relationship to space and location. Those are very specific to this moment.
Right. Yeah.
And the works that come out of this period, which will be many, will be the way that that generations after us understand what this moment meant. I'm actually really surprised that we haven't been examining works that came out of the period of the Spanish flu. But undoubtedly, there will be a lot of attention that will be directed to this period in time through the art that was created for it.
Yeah. Well, you all are making history in a particular kind of way, which brings me to another question that we received, which was someone wanted to know, to what extent art that is about and centered on the pandemic is going to move into the kind of center of our consciousness when we think about art. In other words, we can be certain that there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to come out of this. I mean, some already is, but there will be novels, paintings, operas, dances, theatrical pieces that are going to have a kind of pandemic theme to them in the same way that has come out of, as you say, earlier moments. And certainly we think of the AIDS epidemic, which generated so much extraordinary art. So this certainly will generate something. And the question was, what is that going to play? What role is that sort of stuff going to play going forward as we think about our artistic heritage and artistic traditions?
How many novels, how many operas, how many ballets were inspired by events from the Second World War, or from any major war?
Yeah.
even if we weren't there, this is how we understand our past.
Yeah.
And for years to come, and that's something that will likely shift, you know, as we gain perspective and also get further away from the actual experience.
Right. We'll be developing a new set of memories in that way, and a new relationship to the memory of these experiences. I read a piece in the New York Times a while back by David Brooks, the columnist, who was saying that he had studied the 1918 flu pandemic, and he had always been surprised by the fact that there was not a lot of art that came out of it. I mean, there aren't sort of flu pandemic novels, right? There are Civil War novels or there are World War II novels, but there aren't a lot of flu pandemic novels. And the conclusion that he came to was that there was a lot of very, very questionable behavior that came out of the 1918 flu epidemic. A lot of people didn't behave actually as well as they perhaps should have, and that people didn't want to go back there. It was something they didn't want to think about, and that's an interesting question as well, whether it will just become a black hole in our cultural memory.
It just occurred to me that maybe one of the reasons why there's not so much memorable art created about the Spanish flu was that it's coincidence with the close of the First World War.
It must have been that. Yeah, I think that's a better explanation than David Brooks's explanation, which tends to be a bit moralistic. Yeah, I think that's right. Those two events seem to overlap so much, and it's certainly the case that there were any number of artists who perished in the 1918 flu epidemic. So that's another story. We had another comment that I wanted to share with you, which is just someone who wrote in and stressed how important the physical experience of being in a concert, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but being in a concert or performance space, and the kind of proximity you have to someone who is making something right in front of you. I mean, to sitting, 15 feet away from someone playing the Bach cello suites, it's kind of, it's something. You can't reproduce it. I mean, at least not yet, technologically speaking, and that's powerful sense of the physicality of performance, which seems to me almost overwhelming. And in many cases, it's that experience that takes dominance as much over that in some cases can take dominance over what's actually being done. It's the physicality of the performer, or the person simply being there, or the sound that's coming out of the instrument that you hear as much as you hear what the person's actually playing. And that kind of extra dimension is really something that, to go back to a word that SanSan used early on, that we're all inevitably having to mourn at this moment. I mean, that loss.
It doesn't mean as much when when you have a two-dimensional, shoulder up shot of someone. When you sit in a performance and you see someone perform something that is extraordinary, whether it's dance or singing or playing something on an instrument, you're aware that it's a human being that's doing that,
right.
And a human being who is different from you, but comes with basically the same tools. And theoretically, had you made different decisions in your life, you might be there instead. And we don't have that when you look at a screen, because we've been accustomed to looking at entertainment on screens, right. Things that are prescribed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we've sort of touched on this already, but you cannot replicate the experience of a sound vibration hitting your body, or the kind of mystical experience that happens when you're 15 feet away from someone playing the Bach cello suites. And I think, we get maybe a little closer when we're watching a recorded performance than we are through the medium of the internet, and how we've had to adapt to that. But know, that visceral thing that gets into your body. There's something going on that level that, surpasses everything else that's going on for you.
When we were discussing the pivot, so the dance company I work with is Lenora Lee Dance, and when we were discussing the pivot from what was originally supposed to be an immersive work to something else that wouldn't get anyone sick, one of the things that one of the dancers mentioned was, what about this idea of a kind of really, given all the resources in the world, this really immersive installation that would be all video of dancers, like life size or even bigger, in a room where you would maybe get some sense of a kind of synergistic, kinesthetic feeling. So that was one idea that we were playing with. But yeah, no, I don't think anyone in this space, this virtual space, would argue that that we're missing the live body-to-body interaction.
Can I add one piece here, which is that it's the audience piece that I think we all know the feeling of sitting in a hall that's completely silent for the wrong reason, where that's the sort of silence that you could drive a truck through. And then that type of rapt silence where everyone, a performer can feel this, that where everyone is so intensely focused on the performance, and it's energetic. You feel it around you, whether you're on stage or in the audience, and that's irreplaceable.
Yeah, Jeremy, you're talking about that silence as if it were a material thing that you could drive a truck through. So there you have it.
Yeah, it's that feedback, the constant communication between the bodies, whether you're performing or in the audience, that's really electrifies the situation.
But also, just to play devil's advocate, we could also point out that for a while now, there's been a lot of stuff on the internet, various kinds of avant-garde performance that have taken place, poets who make their art on the internet, various kinds of visual performances, use of images, and so on and so forth, that you really can't do in a concert hall. So there's that aspect of it as well, and that's another resource that can be drawn upon, I guess, is what I would want to suggest.
Yeah, during this time.
And to your point, Tim, I think what we're going to walk away with as presenters, as artists, in this moment is more, from this moment, are more tools in our toolbox.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that those kinds of things, which might have seemed to be sort of fringe performances on YouTube, will be increasingly integrated into a more kind of mainstream, and possibly combined with the more traditional kinds of live performance that we're used to. People have been doing this for a while, obviously, but it will be less strange and less shocking in some way. Yeah. Well, we're at the end of the hour. So I want to thank you again, all three of you, for joining us and for your generosity and sharing your expertise with us. So SanSan Kwan, Myra Melford, and Jeremy Geffen, thank you so much from the Townsend Center for joining us for this event. Let me remind the rest of you that our next event in this series, Remaking Sense, will take place on Thursday, October 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And the title of that event, again, is Changing the Narrative, and that will feature Catherine Gallagher and Anthony Cascardi. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you,
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone.